live right now. So we are live. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, everyone. And I actually have a monologue. I'm starting to do these shows properly now, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. It has been a while since our last episode, and I believe our last episode was 2019 with this man right here. So it kind of seemed apropos to have him be back on our first. I'm thrilled to be back in the studio and connecting with all of you once again. I've missed the space. We've had a lot of changes, especially in terms of our studio equipment and just overall attitude. I've missed obviously everyone, the community within the show and the listeners, which have been such a vital part of the show and why I did this for so long. As some of you may know, it's kind of been a transformative few years for me, to say the least, since we've last spoke. And, I've grown older, I've grown wiser. I'm just going to try and move my iPad over here so it doesn't look like I'm just reading off on the side. So, in many ways, this podcast has been a reflection of that growth. It's a space where I can share my thoughts insights and experiences with myself as well as those of the guests. One thing I'm making a commitment to is providing a space that's free from drama, from politics, and wild conspiracy theories. Although those can sometimes be fun, at the end of the day, I believe the world is complex enough without the added drama and division within the mix. I hope that this podcast can be a space of refuge and positivity for us all. And before we dive into the topics and conversations, I just wanted to take a moment to, eulogize a beloved member of our community, which would be our podcast cat Coco. She was a loyal and loving companion. She passed away last year. And she brought much joy and comfort to many people who were involved with the show. So, and I know a lot of people felt a connection to her as well. So for anybody who's out there, for 19 years of age that she was, give me a hail, Coco. And we can, I know that she's going to be listening in spirit. I also wanted to say that, thank you very much, everyone, for joining me in this reflection as well as the celebration. I'm excited to dive into the world of Peek Woo with you all once again. So let's get started. Our guest for tonight is a dear friend of mine and someone I could not see starting the show back up without having on, which is the great Laird Scranton. Laird and his wife, Risa, have been an incredible positive force in my life and have helped me shape my attitudes towards parenthood and what it means to be a father. Laird is also an author, researcher, and expert on ancient cosmology and language. He's best known for his work in exploring connections between ancient mythologies, sacred symbols, and cosmological beliefs of various cultures around the world, including the Dogon of West Africa, the ancient Egyptians, the Hopi and Zuni tribes of the American Southwest, and the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. Scranton's approach to ancient history is interdisciplinary, drawing upon a range of fields including anthropology, linguistics, and archaeology. He has authored a number of books on these topics, including The Science of the Dogon, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, and the Velikovsky Heresies. Scranton's work has been both praised and criticized by scholars in the field of ancient history and anthropology. Some have lauded his innovative and thought-provoking approach to studying ancient cultures, while others have criticized his theories as speculative and lacking in empirical evidence. Overall, Laird Scranton's work has contributed to the growing body of literature that seeks to understand the cosmological and spiritual beliefs of ancient cultures and the connection between them. Mr. Scranton, Laird, welcome back into the Den of Lore. I was wondering, like, what's that? Hello? I'm like, what? Now, Laird, we're just going to jump right into it because, no one has ever said that I'm not short of words. And to respect the time of yourself as well as two of our listeners, some of whom are listening from the UK. And I know for a couple of people, they're like, oh my goodness, you're coming back tonight. This is going to be a lot of coffee. I'm so sorry, but thank you. Uh, to those of you who, to those of our listeners who may be new, some who have been around for a long time, what has inspired you to start researching ancient cultures and spiritual traditions? Oh, now I do apologize, Laird. Apparently that you're coming in on mute. Let's try that one more time, and if not, then I can see about. I do apologize, everybody. This is our first show back, so I'm still shaking out some of the cobwebs.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Let's see. Worst case, let me see if I can get that. Let's see if there's a Steinberg. No, that probably people heard. So do I have my Yamaha? All right, let's try it again. Are you going through, Laird?
Can you hear me now at this point? Am I coming through?
Yeah, people are saying the audio's back.
Okay. Well, just to repeat what I roughly what I had said before, my background, my degree is in English from Vassar College. My professional background is as a software designer for businesses. And in the mid 1990s, I read a book called Unexplained, written by Jerome Clark, whose focus was on every chapter was dedicated to a long-standing mystery that had not been resolved. And one of those chapters was about the Dogon tribe in Mali. They're a primitive African tribe, a priestly tribe, and they're situated, hours across desert land from anything we'd consider to be civilized. But the tribe knew some things about astronomy that they really shouldn't know without access to powerful telescopes. For example, they knew certain facts about the star system of Sirius. They knew there was a second dwarf star, very heavy, dense, small star that sits in the bright glare of the sunlight star. They knew the correct orbital period for the two stars. They knew things about the disposition of a potential third body in that star system that goes along with how science says it should be situated. So I thought I wanted to look into it. I figured that doing that would could only lead me to interesting things.
Now, can you describe like a specific interest where you encountered this ancient knowledge, where it was like way ahead of its time, besides the Sirius?
Yes, looking at it, there are two ways to look at this: proactively and retrospectively. Proactively, um, coming at the topics with no knowledge of it. Interpretations in my field of study often begin with resemblances. Somebody notices that thing A is in some way like thing B and thinks, well, maybe somebody intended that. Maybe these two things are related. Um, you can anchor that when the ancient culture itself confirms that they intended that. So I noticed that the Dogon priests say that their symbolic tradition describes how matter forms, and they discuss a concept called the Po that is represented very much like an atom, and it's comprised of Sene seeds that are represented correctly like protons and electrons. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. They have the highest two strata of the science of an atom correct. What are the chances that all the descending structures they're trying to describe might also be scientifically correct? The problem was I didn't really have enough knowledge myself to be able to determine that right away. I had to educate myself a little bit about some of the science. So that is what sort of drew me into it. My first book is basically a side-by-side comparison of what the Dogon say with what popularizers of science, such as Stephen Hawking and Brian Greene, have to say. And the representations are so close that in many cases you can take a Dogon description and drawing and substitute it for Stephen Hawking's description and drawing and not significantly change Stephen Hawking's book.
Now, what would be like a specific example of this?
Well, okay, the Dogon say that the atom information is the obvious example. They say that all things are made by continuous addition of similar elements, starting with the Po, and that the Po is comprised of Sene seeds that commingle at the center of the Po and then cross in all directions to form a kind of nest surrounding the Po.
Now,
and they include a drawing with that is a credible representation of one of the orbital shapes of a hydrogen atom.
Okay, well, that was the next question. Would be what would be the for those of us who may not have I should say be as knowledgeable on the terminology, the Po itself. What would that be considered? Like, what would be a contemporary term for that, or an example for that?
Well, the Po is pretty much a direct counterpart to the atom.
Okay.
And there are other representations in other traditions that are sometimes phonetically similar and sometimes not. But so that's what initially drew me into researching the tribe. As it turns out, the Dogon are an excellent starting point. Actually, I could hardly have picked a better starting point because the Dogon culture is a kind of umbrella over a number of different ancient cultures. They have civic practices that are like ancient Egypt, predictably like them. They have religious rituals that are like ancient Judaism. They have a symbolic cosmology that's a very close match for a Buddhist cosmology associated with a Buddhist stupa shrine. Beyond that, the Dogon symbolic tradition has a lot in common with Hinduism and with other traditions. The Dogon language is technically unclassifiable because it enfolds 18 subgroupings of words from other languages. And so you can almost trace a historic lineage of where the Dogon had to have moved over time because they keep these subsets of words coherently intact. You have Turkish words, you have Tamil words of the Dravidian languages, you got ancient Egyptian words, you have Hebrew words, you have some words that are found in Sanskrit. You have words of the Faroese language in an ancient language of the British Isles up in northern Scotland. A whole host of different subgroupings of words.
Sorry,
Hey,
my wife is she just came
May.
back from trivia.
Hi.
Hi, honey.
Picked up your thing that you wanted me to pick up, and I'm going to bed.
Thank you very much.
Night, night.
Oh, I love her so much.
I can see why.
I forgot what I was going to ask.
Well, so because the Dogon are they make an excellent entry point for a comparative study, which is what I do. I try to learn more about myths and symbols and words and rituals of ancient cultures by comparing how different cultures understand the same elements. Pick one element that's well defined in one culture and then compare how the other cultures treat it.
Well, how would you explain that a lot of these cultures seem to have such a deep understanding of the natural world?
Well, the Dogon and the Buddhists both say that in ancient times, a group of teachers who were very knowledgeable. These are teachers who were um, fully on top of all of the science, conducted instruction globally on the planet. That they took representatives of tribal groups from around the world and um, taught them civilizing skills and taught them concepts of science, um, all in very similar terms with each other, which is where Jung's archetypes seem to come from.
Oh, and that would be a good shout out for Laura from Speaking with Young. I know that when I first posted the show, she's like, "Oh my God, Chris, are you doing a show tonight?" I'm like, "Hey, Laura, how's it going?" So that I'm sure that would be something that she'd love to be able to comment on. Now, for these types of like for these types of cross-cultural and natural phenomena that seem to be cropping up within these cultures that have such interconnectivity. Now, like how would you look at your process for cross-cultural analysis?
Okay, the biggest threat to a person in my field of work is what I call wishful interpretation. The human brain is wired in a way to see patterns. We're wired to try to sort out patterns. We're trying to make sense out of what's sometimes a nonsensical world, to the point that we sometimes see patterns where they don't really exist. A child can lie on the grass um, in a park and look up at the sky and see the clouds and imagine images of animals or objects or so forth. Um, Now, the cloud doesn't really represent that thing, but the brain imagines that it does. So, the first rule that I make to protect myself against wishful interpretation is that interpretation always has to begin with a clear statement on the part of one of the ancient cultures. For example, with the Dogon, it wasn't until I read that the Dogon priest said that their symbolic system represents science, that I started to entertain that idea. If the idea comes from me as the first source of it, um, it's not a reliable thing. Somebody in ancient times has to have thought a thing for it to be legitimate.
And how would you differentiate between like this symbolic interpretation that would be plausible versus, let's say, something that would be considered complete speculation?
Well, there are any number of areas um, where people have made speculations about, how they think the pyramids were built,
Mhm.
for example. Um, we've had engineers attempt to replicate on a small scale the construction of the pyramid, and they know that certain things are doable and certain things aren't. But those end up bumping up against the limits of what science will allow to be true. And the first thing that somebody discovers in my field of work is that um, there are things going on that we can't immediately explain.
I look at it more from the position of, the human mind can try so hard to try and find patterns within things. It's why we see, a turtle in clouds, or the patterns within everyday objects which we feel that would have some type of importance. Or I'll use the example, if circle must be Atlantis. Kind of speculation when it comes to certain geological formations. Do you think that there's always the possibility that within certain interpretations there could be that stretch for the mind to try and find meaning within something that there may not be? And how do you kind of account for that within your own analysis?
Well, the second principle that I apply to what I do is that once I've arrived at what I think is the correct interpretation of a thing, you have to be able to answer a very simple question. You have to complete a very simple sentence The sentence is, we know this must be true because, and then be able to fill in the rest of the sentence with something that your average person is going to intuitively understand as a compelling reason why we have to think it.
Okay.
So that's where I normally start with other researchers is to say to ask, what would you say your top fact is or factor is that compels us to see this thing the way you see it? Why do we have to look at it that way?
And how is this held up to scrutiny with certain, whether we're talking mainstream or other individuals? I know with any research or any position, doesn't matter if it's yours, doesn't matter if it's Hancock's, it doesn't matter if it's a mainstream academic. There's always going to be the picking apart of an idea to try and get to the crux of it, or to try and determine whether it's true, or again, in certain cases, for people who just feel that they got to tear people down or what have you, they're going to trying their best to be able to debunk it. Have you run into any instances where a situation that this has been the case, either from your own, like in your own internal retrospective on your analysis, where you've torn your own idea down, even if it seems that it fits?
Well, I was lucky as an elementary school child to be involved in some sort of enrichment type science classes. Actually, an excellent program in Salem, Oregon. But the first thing my science teachers taught us was the concept of sincerely entertaining an idea. What they said was, anytime you have a mystery or a scientific question you're trying to sort out, and there's more than one potential answer, that what you're required to do is to sincerely entertain each one. And what I mean by that is, it's the same process you go through. Say you offered to show me a shortcut to work that would save me 10 minutes each way, even though I've been going to and from work for 20 years, that you came up to me one day and said, there's a shortcut you can take that you don't know about that will get you there 10 minutes quicker. So when I agree to let you show me that shortcut, I'm taking on a certain kind of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
The first responsibility is, if you try to take me up a dead end, what I think is a dead end street, I can't say, wait, hold up here. That's a dead end street. We can't go up that way. It's dead end. Instead, it's my job to say, well, I thought that was a dead end street. I see there's a dead end street sign, but you're telling me this isn't a dead end street. Show me how it's not. So the onus is on me. Whenever you hit one of those junctures where you might be tending to balk, to set aside my own objection, to ask myself, what would have to change in my outlook for your perspective on it to be correct? And then we follow through on your perspective of it till we get to the end. And when we get to the end, you've either gotten me to work faster or you haven't. Now, if you do that for each one of the possible answers to a scientific question, things start to sort themselves out. You start to discover that certain approaches answer the question much better than other approaches. And that, in fact, you can recognize when it's the right approach, because all of the little nagging, interminable little obstacles that seem to crop up in the way dissolve if you approach it that way. And that's true with the Dogon approach to this science, is that a lot of the things that science bumps up against when they're talking about the quantum domain and quantum uncertainty and wave particle interactions and so things like that, the things that are obstacles that they can't seem to get over, evaporate away if you look at things the way the Dogon do.
And again, to be able to carry on, and I know William Pullen is watching the show, and he mentioned that he appreciates the refreshing look and listening to the refreshing, the refreshing listen to a measured scientific discussion about the investigative process. And this is the kind of show that I want to be able to have for anybody who's listening or watching, that whether it's an idea that mainstream will agree with, or if it's something that the non-mainstream part of academia doesn't will agree with or not agree with, I want to be able to hear the opinions and hear what people have to say, and especially since I've talked to Laird many times.
Right.
I know that he's going to have his his ducks in a row when it comes to his work. I'm looking at also from the fact that mainstream academia itself will they're going to have reluctance to embracing these this type of alternative idea, especially when it comes to your work. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, it's not a problem for someone to question an outlook that I'm presenting. I mean, they should be asking the same question I would, which is, how is it that we're compelled to look at it this way? Now, if they're sincere about that question, that opens the door for me to walk them through, to step them through the thought process of how we get from point A to point Z with whatever the topic happens to be. So I'm perfectly happy with that. And if along that way they present a point that I'm not capable of answering, then that opens doors to research for me, or it throws up questions to my outlook for me.
You have been doing this for a number of years. I believe one of the first interviews that you had on video was from the Magical Egypt series, and I know it was kind of like one of the later episodes, and it was an addendum. I'm going to butcher that word. I'm sorry, everybody. My pronunciation's gone right to heck the last couple of years. You've been doing this for a long time, and within that 20-30 year span of your work, and not with that, not naming any names, have you had somebody from mainstream academia come to you and say, you know what, I don't agree with what you're saying, or I don't necessarily agree with your position or your point? Can you walk me through your thought process to show me how this goes? And has it gotten to the point where you've been able to either change their mind, or at least seeing them have their paradigm shifted to a point where they're at least able to look from a different perspective?
No, there are lots of reasons why a traditional mainstream academic doesn't really want to get involved in a discussion about something they consider to be fringe. And so that sort of filters out a lot of that, because they really aren't, I mean, as a rule, they really aren't interested in hearing the perspective. So you don't really get that a lot of times. You and I were both friendly with John Anthony West, and there were a number of times through my process where John and I would land on polar opposite sides of an answer to a question. Now, John was somebody that I knew was a very careful researcher. He did not endorse an outlook unless he had good reason to endorse it. So that made me think that there must be an umbrella perspective over both positions. And so I would go out and actively look for that umbrella perspective. And every time I would end up coming back. For example, at Göbekli Tepe, there was a debate as to whether certain symbols there represented the concept of a sanctuary, or whether they represented the concept of a house. Well, it turns out if you dig deeply enough, you discover that the same symbol can represent either thing in different cultures. So it's not a question of one being right or the other one being right. It's a question of taking that disagreement to expand the perspective that we both have.
Now, this is an interesting question from, I know that there one individual in the chat, August, wants me to ask if you've ever been open to live debates, or have you done live debates before?
I've been parts of panel discussions. I've been involved with debates on podcast type discussions before. It all depends on how it's handled, because if people come into a debate with entrenched positions, then it's not going to get anywhere. It's going to start out polarized, and it's going to stay polarized the entire time. I'd rather approach something like that from the standpoint of one or the other person saying, here's how I see the issue, and now let me walk everybody through it, and be the sounding board for that. I discovered as a software designer that quite often a programmer will get in a situation where they had a logical problem in their software that they simply were not able to find. They would beat their head against the wall for hours or for days, and they couldn't turn up the answer. But The moment they invited another programmer over to stand next to them and just listen, just stand there, not say anything, just listen, and talk the logic out to that person, they discovered their own false assumption.
Isn't that the same as the rubber duck method? If there's any programmers, they should know. You get your little rubber duck and you explain the code to them and step them through step by step.
Yeah, same thing. I used to joke that I wanted to market a dummy on wheels that you could roll over to your desk and talk the thing out to. So the thing with trying even with a panel discussion, panel discussions are difficult because again, the various members of the panel discussion each have their own specialty field, and they each have their own credentials in their specialty field and their own investment in a perspective about a question. So in that kind of a situation, what I tend to do is I tend to, let's back this up a little bit. My approach is a little like the children's game Clue. That if you came to me and proposed that the murderer was Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick, and I don't have any card in my hand to flatly discredit that, then if I do have a card to discredit it, I show it and I say, I appreciate the perspective. It can't be that because of this. But if I don't have a card in my hand to flatly discredit it, then you allow the person their perspective, and you realize that there's an open question here that has to be researched, and eventually the thing will sort itself out. But you're looking for the points of overlap with the other researchers, not the points of disagreement. And you try to emphasize the points of overlap with the other researcher and work from those as kind of a starting point.
Yeah, and that's very similar approach to the way that I have remembered way back when. We're talking 2016, 2017. And I remember in a discussion with Dr. Schock, I know that there had been a discussion and not knowing within the realm of academia exactly what the word debate means, which can be, as you mentioned, extremely combative.
Right.
And the concept of having a debate between him and Randall Carlson vis-a-vis the comet impact versus solar solar mass ejection to be able to explain the Younger Dryas. Now, knowing that they've talked probably many times since then, and there's has been a lot of crosstalk and sharing of ideas. Not understanding that as a layperson, not within academia itself, knowing that for somebody who is in academia or who is in a researcher, whether it's from software or from dealing with rocks and water erosion, it opens up a lot of anxiety within that sphere, within that possibility for discussion. If somebody's saying, "Hey, I'm going to go into a debate," and that academic is, "Oh my goodness, I'm basically going to be attacked for 60 minutes."
Right.
Who on earth, besides me, obviously, would want to go into that kind of long-term conflict? It is, if it's extremely difficult. We deal with enough stress on a daily basis, so I can understand to some people who may not be open to it. Obviously, if it is within the realm of a field, it's kind of necessary, especially when you're dealing with like dissertations or trying to defend your thesis. But I feel if we as a society were able to share each other's ideas, even if somebody says, "Okay, well, this idea is like, I think it's not good." Okay, at least I can see somebody's perspective on something versus, "Well, your idea is no good, so I'm not even going to listen to it." I don't think that's necessarily healthy. Although, at the end of the day, there's also that, the logical part of my brain that's going like, not all ideas are necessarily valid. But at the same time, you can still consider the idea, or at least try and see it from that perspective, and then come to a conclusion. But to discount it completely outright without doing that first, I feel is somewhat it does a disservice to the field. Like, if I'm going to program something, or if I'm going to design a website, and I'm saying, well, I'm never going to use this feature, and I see it working somewhere else, I'm like, okay, well, maybe maybe that's something I can incorporate into my own work. I wish more people did that, especially whether it be mainstream or not, just because at best it would be more fun.
Right. Well, it also helps if you can focus discussion on a single principle or issue at a time. Because when you do that, find that um, different researchers, or if we're talking politics, different people with different positions in politics, they'll either arrive at the point of disconnect in their outlooks if you're talking about a single issue, or else they'll realize they have more in common with each other about it than they thought when they started out. And so, not overcomplicating it. As soon as you start to overcomplicate it, things get so messy that nobody could ever, entangled, so nobody can sort it out. So you try to keep the focus simplified.
Now, before we really dive into the newer work, I'd love to know what would your advice be for somebody who happens to stumble across this channel and, let's say, says, who's this Laird Scranton guy, who may not have heard of your work before, although pretty much everyone's heard of you, Laird. You're famous. It's fantastic. I love it. What would you say to somebody who may not have heard of you, where they should start looking when it comes to exploring ancient cultures of spirituality, and the connections between them, either from the academic side or from, let's say, more of the alternative view?
Okay, first understand that the information we're looking for is the oldest information. That if we go back in time in ancient cultures prior to around 500 BC, elements of the cosmological tradition that are original to the tradition come with a degree of self-confirmation built into them. Confucius at 500 BC complained loudly that he could no longer count on ancient Chinese words to convey their own meanings. That in China, the original form of symbolic language in China, each word explained its own meaning through the symbols used to write it. That's also true with Egyptian hieroglyphics. With the Dogon language, the Dogon preserve a set of what I consider to be original syllables of cosmological syllables, where every syllable corresponds to one or more concepts. And that if you're trying to build a more complicated word, you mix and match those syllables while you're mixing and matching concepts to express what it is you're trying to say in the word. So if I know how a Dogon word was originally pronounced, I can most often predict what it was intended to mean. Same thing with ancient Egyptian words. If once you start to understand that every glyph represents a concept in that same way, you substitute concepts for glyphs and you produce a symbolic sentence that represents the intended meaning of the word of the scribe who wrote it down. You don't have to guess. And so you're trying to get down to an early enough level in things where things are explicit. And so it takes the researcher out of the process of trying to understand what this thing means. One of the sort of side projects I've been working on is what I call evolving a list of ancient Egyptian glyph shapes in derived sequence. And what I mean by that is I start with the very simplest ones where a concept is represented by a single glyph, so there's no doubt what the glyph represents, and work forward from those to more complicated words with the idea of never using a glyph that I haven't already explained and justified the meaning of. And so from that, I'm now in a position if somebody says, well, why is it that we think that this glyph means this thing? I can copy and paste out of this document the whole trail, however long the trail is, of justification for meanings for the glyphs that produce a meaning in a word.
That's a really, really good approach, because if somebody, especially if you have access to, your lexicon, on your phone. I know you're working on a, you said you're working on a Chromebook, but nowadays, like I've got my documents stored on the cloud, whether it's on Dropbox or OneDrive. You can have your entire lexicon basically at your fingertips, and if somebody asks you a question, if you know exactly where it is, what document it's going to be in, what page it's going to be on, even if you don't, you can still search for it and then bring that information up right at the get-go, which is wild if you think about it, because even 5 or 10 years ago, that would have been much more difficult to do.
Right. And I use my own books that way. Very often, when someone wants to know what was the original reference for such and such, I find it quicker by scanning my own book than by trying to track back now through all the different sources I have, which volume of Schwaller's was it, and which chapter that he said blah, blah, blah.
When was the last time you had to do something like that?
Oh, all the time. I get questions all the time from people saying, can you tell me what this means and why do you think it means that?
Like we're talking just like random on Facebook, you'll get like an other message, and it's like, "Hey, Laird, I
Yep.
was yeah."
Exactly. But I've also learned to pay attention to those because those are quite often not incidental. For example, in like 2012 or so, I received an email from a person like that, from a person I didn't know in Australia, wanting to know if I thought researchers were seeing ancient Egyptian influences at the Skara Brae village on Orkney Island in northern Scotland.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know the first thing about Scotland or about the Skara Brae village, but I have learned that when a seemingly random question like that comes out of the blue to me from somebody I don't know, that the question's for me. I mean, the benefit of the question is to me, if I'm willing to put in the effort to look into it.
And as I recall
so
from
an entire book came out, actually 2 entire books worth of information came out of that, looking into that one question.
and as I recall, a couple of trips as well. There's tons of beautiful pictures of you, and I know Isaac went with you on that one, and
Right.
Skara Brae being so far north, and being a Scotch guy myself, you got to think it's like, did they make their own Scotch? Is there like a Skara Brae flavor or malt that just I'm more of a Speyside guy myself. Just and I know some people are more like Islay, and that's besides the point. The fact is that these types of interesting questions will crop up, and I know I'm interested to hear like how this kind of thing would like shed light on, let's say, the origins of life on Earth, or what kind of even like what are you seeing as far as like transformations from, as you're seeing from like from, let's say, from energy to an atom. And I know that's going to lead into your latest book release, but the Emma and the Spark of the Universe is, like, when you had described it to me, just sounded so just fascinating, and it's such a somewhat of a departure from your usual work, where you're dealing with symbolism and where this knowledge came from, to, hey, let's start getting into like some quantum physics and the
Right.
origins of energy and matter, which is kind of, it's my bag, as it were.
Okay, if I had to characterize what the framers of the symbolism were after, they were trying to convey the idea, first of all, that these energetics are not brain surgery. It's not rocket science. That, contrary to what modern religion tells us, or what exoteric public religion tells us, exoteric Buddhism says these concepts of creation are ultimately unknowable. Don't even try. You get to, well, as I was working through the symbolism, I was increasingly seeing that the concepts were entirely knowable, and eventually discovered that esoteric Buddhism flatly says that. It says, look, folks, we were fibbing about that unknowable stuff, that in fact this is all completely knowable. What they're ultimately talking about is a handful of dynamics of energy that can be observed on any scale you want to look at, whether it's the quantum scale, the atomic scale, the scale of everyday life, the scale of the solar system, the scale of the universe. It's all the same dynamics of energy repeating in similar form over and over and over and over again. And so all of these references are trying, in a sort of a desperate attempt, to get us to connect with that on whatever level we're capable of connecting to it on. If we connect to it through the idea of how a plant grows from a seed, fine, great. If we want to connect to it based on the domains of the animal kingdom, fine, we'll do that. If we can get to it through primordial states of matter like water, fire, wind, earth, fine, we'll get to it that way. But ultimately, what they're trying to accomplish is to define for us in unmistakable ways the root nature of the energies involved, and then how those energies interact. And that same cluster of energies interacting in that same way, they say, are responsible for the formation of matter, the formation of the universe, the creation of biological life, and the creation of consciousness. And understand anyone, consequently, okay, what the Dogon do is they're preserving a series of symbols, a single series of symbols that simultaneously describe all four of those themes. So every symbol has pertinence of meaning to each one of those themes. For example, if we're talking about biological life, the shape of a hemisphere represents the expansion of the womb of a woman. If we're talking about the formation of matter, the symbol of a hemisphere represents the expansion of mass that before mass particles are created. So part of the reason why these symbols are so hard to get our arms around is because they move in so many different dimensional directions depending on what the context is. And the meanings are similar from theme to theme and are parallel in terms of how they play out in a series, but there are different nuances of meaning depending on whether we're talking about biology or whether we're talking about matter, and so on.
Now, I'm going to ask I'll ask the question because I know someone else out there is going to ask it. How do we know that this is the case? At least I would ask for at least one example where you can step me through it. How do we know it's the case where this is what's being represented versus the is circle must be Atlantis? Or at least that fallacy that I am starting. I'm gonna coin that one. Help me to at least understand, and for the listeners out there to know how that how it isn't just a leap of logic, and that you've arrived at that at a in a way that makes sense, or at least will make sense to me. Hopefully.
Okay. Well, it builds over time,
Okay.
and the starting point is really language. Okay. Now, with the Dogon dictionary, we have an explicit statement of what each of the syllables represent.
Okay.
So when we take a larger word that combines two or more of those syllables, that means a particular thing, we can directly demonstrate that relates to the meaning of the individual symbols. It's intuitive. Of course, this means what the Dogon say it means because it combines syllables that mean these two things and add them together and you get that. It's obvious. Now, you can do the same thing with each of the individual symbols in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language. I'll give you an example of how it works. If I had had perfect knowledge before I started looking at hieroglyphs, I would have saved myself a lot of trouble. There's a very simple ancient Egyptian word for the concept of a week, as in days of the week. It's written with two glyphs. The first glyph is the sun glyph. It's a circle with a dot in the middle of it, and it can represent the concept of a day. And the second glyph is an upside down U, which is the Egyptian number 10. So I looked at the word and I said, symbolically, that says to me 10 days. And so I went and I did some research and discovered the ancient Egyptians observed a 10-day week.
Oh my God, I don't even know if I could deal with that. I can barely deal with 5-day week.
the form of the word itself conveyed correct information to me about Egyptian culture that I didn't know before I looked at the word, and I was able to confirm afterwards. Now, you take it the next step and you go to ancient China, and in their earliest form of symbolic language, the word for week was written with the sun glyph, which was originally round with a dot in the middle of it, and their number 10, and they observed a 10-day week. We have direct eye-to-eye comparability between Egyptian and Chinese hieroglyphs at that point in time, at that level of understanding.
For anybody out there, a comment if your Wednesday was 3 days long, if you would jump into the Nile. Let the crocodiles take you. It's like Friday is 5 days away, and now it's 4 days away, and now it's three. Like, how many?
Well,
It's like,
the
I just
Dogon,
want to have my mead and go build my pyramid with my friends.
yeah, see, the Dogon feel like you do. They now celebrate a 5-day week.
Oh, that's very smart of them. It's very progressive.
Okay, so those are examples of how it's possible to pin down the meaning, a precise meaning, and an objective meaning of what symbols are representing and what certain words are representing, what certain phonetic values are representing. So as you build those, okay, there's another class of ancient Egyptian words where that symbolic sentence is followed by a glyph that is not pronounced. And for the traditional Egyptologists, they say, well, that trailing glyph is there for emphasis. Usually it has bears some relationship to the concept that the word expresses. But I can see, coming at it from the Dogon syllables and the way they work that, the purpose of that word is to assign a meaning, a symbolic meaning, to the trailing glyph. And so let's say that the word was defining the concept of a table with a picture of a table, that I would expect to be able to go find ancient Egyptian words for table that are written with that same glyph.
And I know with the languages are different. I know with Egyptian and at least with Dogon, the way that it's being described, it's not a phonetic language. It's more of an allegorical language. The concept is supposed to be ingrained within the symbolism so that you understand the concept when you look at it. It's not, and I know depending on which, whether you're talking Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, if it's proto-script or not, I'm not 100% certain, but at least from what I can understand, it is also supposed to be a written language, but it is also a symbolic language. So the metaphors and the concepts are conveyed in addition to the actual sound. And again, not to try and make light of language too much, but I would wonder in about 5,000 years if somebody looks at the word subtle and they see the B is silent. What did that B represent?
Yes, right. No, I can see you saying that, but to have it work for one word is one thing. To then be able to generalize that and say all words work that way is an entirely different thing.
Okay.
So these are some of the tools we have to work with to try to confirm meaning. Now, when it comes to talking about science, the Dogon are driving this. They're the ones who are saying we have a concept of an atom called a po, and we have a concept of protons and electrons that are senescedes. They're describing their concepts to me. And all I'm doing is, having recognized that it looks like science to me, I'm playing that game of show me the shortcut. I'm testing each of the statements that Dogon make about what they say is true against the actual science. I go and find the guy who understands the science and who can explain it to me in plain English and see how close his explanation is to what the Dogon are saying.
It's interesting to me that the symbol for the day is the circle with the one electron, and one electron. I'm already striking out with what I'm about to say. That it's the circle within the dot within a circle, which obviously within even ancient traditions is has its own symbolism. Or for the sun, it could be for many things. I know it was used primarily in certain things for being able to draw a circle so that you can then square it, so that you can then build something on top of it.
Right.
But the way that we look at it also, and I'm bringing to mind Dr. Manhattan from the Watchman, where his logo, his symbol was the dot with the circle around it, which is the symbol for hydrogen.
Right. Now, that's an additional complication here that has to be taken into consideration. That every symbol in this tradition carries a cluster of meanings. In fact, every word carries a cluster of meanings. Now, that might seem like it makes things difficult, but in fact, it facilitates correlations, because those clusters of meanings, and these are discrete meanings, so that knowing the first meaning, you can't automatically guess the secondary meanings. They're not intuitively directly related to each other. You couldn't, the average person would not imagine the second, third, and fourth meanings would go with the first one. So now you go to an entirely different language like Sanskrit, and you discover, even with different phonetics, that the word that means the first thing also means the other four things. You've got positive correlation between the words outside of the boundaries of traditional etymology of language. That the problem with trying to compare words between languages is that there are only about 40 phonetic values that are typically represented in a written language. And so the chances of two cultures coincidentally representing the same idea with the same phonetic are very high. It's too easy for it to be coincidence. But when you're not dealing with one meaning, when you're dealing with a cluster of discrete meanings and you have the match, now you can say these came out of the same source tradition. These are related.
It could be from a proto language. The great mother language, as they say.
Right. But if you can demonstrate in one of the languages, like the Dogon language, that's a cosmological language, then what you just demonstrated is that all those cultures that have those clusters of meanings are related to the cosmology that goes way back, which is one of the things I'm trying to demonstrate.
And like even when you have words like I think it's like mom or mama is actually a word that has been used throughout human history for like the last 10,000 years, and it's still used today. So it's one of those, the potential where even if it's going to be seen across multiple cultures, is it one of those base words because it's such an intrinsic part of what the human experience on a day-to-day basis.
Well,
no pun intended.
Because it's one of the sounds that an infant can first make. And so, of course, an infant's going to call mother and father mama or dada. In the Dogon language, dada is actually a name for the mother because that's the sound they're able to make. And you have to be careful not to trip up with that. But another thing my science teachers taught was that a coincidence, when we say that something is a coincidence, we mean that maybe 1 in 1,000 times it should happen. We should find it happening. By the time you bump up against the third coincidence, a good researcher needs to start to allow that something beyond coincidence may be going on. Because the odds of getting 3 compounding coincidences are astronomical.
What would be another example of this besides just the day or 10 or the day and 10? Is it like, have you been running into anything else within this realm?
Well, we're working from the concept of the atom, the Dogon concept of the atom, that I've come across researchers who seem to have endless tolerance for coincidence. It doesn't matter how far down the scale you go, and you show what the Dogon are describing and drawing matches what a Stephen Hawking or a Brian Greene is describing and drawing. Item. At some point down that scale, any reasonable researcher is going to say, this can't possibly still be coincidence. The odds are so impossible. There's something else going on here besides coincidence.
And how are you attributing this coincidence? Like, is it coming from, in your opinion, like a source location? Are we talking, an even older, more ancient culture than what we have that we're seeing? What's your position on this?
Again, it's not my position. It's the position of the cultures. The Dogon are saying that in ancient times, a group of teachers who thoroughly understood the science came and taught this stuff to them. And Buddhism says the same thing. Buddhism flatly states that the most, quote unquote, most sacred symbols of the Buddhist tradition are deemed to have been gifted to humanity by a non-human source.
This is this like, are we talking? Are they saying this is like a non-human source? Is this like something that they're getting from from extraterrestrial? Is it extra dimensional? Is it something that they're receiving from sources through some type of psychoactive substance that they're ingesting? That they're pulling this from, let's say, the ether, as it were.
Okay,
What are they saying regarding this?
I'm gonna Marty McFly you here.
It's been a while, so I
okay. At the bottom, what's going on here with energy at the bottom is a dynamic that moves energy. Okay, we have two qualities of energy. We have magnetism and electricity that are in a dimensional relationship with each other. They express themselves perpendicularly to each other. Okay. In any given circumstance, what's going on with the continuum of energy is it's moving from a state where magnetism is dormant and electricity is unresisted. It's called superconductivity. To a state where the reverse of that is true, where magnetism is unresisted and the electricity is dormant. That's called superinsulation. And it oscillates back and forth between those two positions. Now, the critical factor in the mindset of the ancient cosmology of what's changing as you move along that continuum is if you're moving from where magnetism is not measurable to where it's dominant, then you're progressively increasing magnetism as you move across the continuum. And when you increase magnetism, you're also increasing mass. And Einstein says when you increase mass, you slow the pace of time. Now, in the Dogon and the Egyptian conception, over the course of that continuum, as you're slowing down the pace of time, there are a couple of things going on. One of the critical things that's going on is that every so often the energy hits a resonance point, and you end up with 14 separate domains of energy being outlined across that continuum. That's actually the same thing that scientists document when they lay out the electromagnetic spectrum. They conceptualize it in terms of 14 domains of wavelengths. Same concept the Dogon have. Now, in Hinduism, let me back up. Those two energies, when they interact with each other, the natural attributes of those energies create things that are important to us. The ratio between magnetism and electricity is the speed of light. It doesn't change with wavelength. The ratio stays the same. The speed of light is a constant because it's a natural ratio between those two energies. The natural oscillation between those two energies is the metronome of time. However, as you're expanding wavelengths, as you move out, you're slowing down that metronome. It's going slower and slower and slower and slower. Now, we can demonstrate intuitively that that's what might be going on in the universe in a couple of really simple ways. One way is the scientists look with their telescopes out into the expanses of the universe. The further out they go, the older the structures are that they see. And they've discovered that the further out they go, the faster things are moving. And so they're postulating that there must be some dark energy capable of pushing the universe in all directions in such a way that it continues to accelerate it more and more and more and more. The Dogon are saying, no, that's not what's happening. What's happening is we're seeing the consequence of the slowing of our own time frame over time. The further out we look, we're seeing domains where time ran quicker than it does for us because our domain is more massive. To answer your question about the teachers, Hinduism associates those same domains with levels of consciousness. Consciousness is, back up again here. If you look at a scene with one eye closed, you get a 2D perspective on it. Mm-hmm. Most people, when they open both eyes, automatically by being able to reconcile two slightly differing views of the same thing, it produces a 3D image, not a 2D image. It's a natural effect of the two perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness is treated as, or the potential for consciousness is treated as the natural consequence of reconciling the two, what happens in terms of the two energies. That magnetism, consciousness is the ability to take a thing in overview, break it down into its components conceptually, and build it back up again. Magnetism provides us with the overview perspective. Electricity provides us with the detailed linear perspective. And we can't do both at the same time. When we look at a thing in overview, it's a very quick mental action. When we try to examine it and break it down into units, it's a very slow interaction, and we can't be thinking about the overview at the same time we're thinking about the sequential elements of it. It's a natural aspect of perception. So the Dogon are saying that, the Hindus are saying that each of those domains of energy coincides with a level of consciousness. That each has the same potential for consciousness we do because it's interacting with the same energy. And so the materialization of anything is a phase transition. It's a consequence of slowing down the pace of time in the same way that the phase transition from liquid water to ice is a consequence of slowing down or of lowering the temperature and slowing down the motion of the molecules of the water. And automatically by slowing those molecules, you can get the thing to solidify. We have, according to this system rests on a philosophy called Samkhya that comes out of India that's a companion to yoga. Samkhya says universes form in pairs, one more energetic and one more material. And there's a cycle of energy that flows between the universes that's shifting energy and mass from one to the other. The same way that an hourglass shifts sand from the top globe into the bottom globe.
The many conversations we had are just starting to flood back now. Like, oh yeah, we've talked about this before.
Okay, now what you're doing with the energy is you're slowing the pace of time. And just as with the hourglass, there's a point in the middle of the cycle of the hourglass where you have the same amount of sand in the top globe as you have in the bottom one. Now, if we were talking about differences in energy or differences in pace of time, what you have at that moment is equalization of the two time frames. The Dogons say at that point in the cycle, it's no different than equalizing pressure underwater from a submarine or in space from a space station. If you can equalize the pressures, it's now safe to move from your domain into the other domain. And they're saying that's what their teachers did. That at that point in the cycle, around 3600 BC, about the point the Hebrew calendar starts, that their teachers were able to take material form and interact one-on-one with us, real-time, everyday life interaction, and teach us these things.
I'll ask the age-old question: why? Why would they? There's always a
what's
the motivation?
You're not going to like the explanation here, but this is why. With that cycle of energy also relates directly to the sleep cycle. But it relates more directly to the sleep cycle of a dolphin than it does to us. A dolphin experiences something called unihemispheric sleep. That's what keeps a dolphin from drowning. Well, half of its brain goes to sleep while the other half remains awake. Now, we know that at the depth of the sleep cycle, that the brain is very active, but all action has been inhibited to stop you from acting out what you're dreaming during the REM sleep cycle. These energetics work the same way. What's happening is that the domain that is becoming less and less material, more and more energetic, suddenly comes to realize that where it's headed to is a place that's very much like REM sleep.
Laird, you still with us? I think Laird froze. Oh, reconnecting. I think that's on. they always freeze when it's like it's like, you know, taking a bad photo. Like you blink, and yeah, you know what? I think let's. All right, let me see here. I have to get Laird back on. I'm going to need to add a scene here. Display capture, camera, video capture device. Create a new one. And we'll go. Here we go. Are we on? No, I am. All right, give me a second, everybody. Let me see if I can just get Laird back here. I think his internet may have cut out, and that happens from time to time. All right, let's see if we can get him back here. All right. Okay. All right, well, let's see. All right, so Laird's wife has informed me that Laird's trying to reconnect, so I'm guessing it's possible his Wi-Fi is out. For some reason, my camera is not even working. Let's see if I can get that to configure video. No. Why is this happening now? Oh. All right, bear with me here. I know it's been a while. This is the same old camera that I had before. I may actually have to pull my... This is the C930 that I've had since forever. And I know it's the one that I've always had issues with. So I don't have any video coming in right now. And I'm not even sure why I can't get it to work. Let's configure crossbar, configure video, activate and active. There we go. Is it working? Okay. Nope. I said, I'm not saying it was aliens, but all right, let me see if I can reset this transform. There we go. My goodness. All right, we're going to see if we can get Laird back on here. So, you know, at least, you know, for this segment, I know that for the interview segments, we're normally going to be doing them for about an hour and a half. So I'd love to be able to see what questions everyone has. So once we can get Laird back on, we can start asking him. There was a few that we had received from, you know, let's say William from way back earlier on in the episode. I may need to go through the chat, but if anyone has any, they can throw that back in, and we can ask Laird, or see, he's going to go try a different computer. You know, technical difficulties have always been a staple of this show. I gotta say, it's been quite some time, and even with things like, you know, the camera at a very, very low frame rate, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You know, I think I'm going to pull my other webcam in from my other office and see if I can get some better picture out of that, or if anyone's got any suggestions for a good webcam for streaming. It's been a while since I've been in the games, so you know, this kind of gear upgrade may be in order depending on what the other camera does. I always thought the other camera, the 920, always brought the reds out of the chair a lot better, and the blacks tended to be a lot deeper. Whereas with this one, it just gets really choppy, whether it's in dark light or in highlight, even though it's supposed to be the, you know, Carl Zeiss Premier Logitech camera. Michael, if you can retype it, because I'm not sure where in the chat stream And we've had a very active chat tonight. And, oh, let's see. We might be able to bring Laird back on here. 1 second. Do we have Laird? Laird, can you hear me? Oh, let's see. I'm going to have to turn the camera off here. Let's see, go back to the original scene. Audio video settings. And back on. Laird? Laird, are you with us? Have you come in from that void between universes? Oh, I may need to set this back up again. So I got that. Defaults. Test, 1, 2. All right. Let's go back here. All right, Laird, I can see that you're connected, but I can't hear you at the moment. There we go. Laird, are you with us?
I'm trying.
Oh, I can hear you.
You can hear me. I don't have video.
Okay. Let me see here.
The little thingy. That
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
I think I'm coming up.
Click that again.
Thank you, Raisa.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Now click the up arrow. Camera. There.
There we go. Can you see me?
I cannot.
No, click on the arrow, not the picture.
See, the cool part for everyone out there, I'm intending to actually stream these, and then I'm going to download them, edit them, and then repost them, because apparently live streams are not very good for the algorithm. So,
Nothing to do here. Chris, I'm going to sign out of Skype and sign back in and try again.
okay, not a problem. Let's see here.
See, that's see, he's hearing this.
Right.
All right, let's see if I can. If anyone knows a good joke. All right, well, at least in the meantime, I know while Laird is signing out and signing back in, somewhat parallel to this, and I'm going to bring up, the latest advancements in AI technology. Has anyone been using ChatGPT at all? Because I have to say, it's like for any of the running a podcast is a lot of work, and I got to say, with things like ChatGPT or any of the advancements that we've
There you
seen
go.
out of
Answer phone, not video.
Well, because I didn't have a video option.
All right, let's see if I can. Window capture. See, Laird. Okay, we got you, and my camera I think is off, so I'm going to bring my camera back on.
Can you see me?
I can see fine. I'm off camera, unfortunately. Let's see if I can unplug my camera a little. All right. There we go. No, we'll do this.
Okay, finally. Sorry about that. I switched to Reese's PC. Okay,
Hi,
we were
everybody.
talking about. Okay, we were talking about what the motive was for the non-material to want to teach us. The motive is something called locked-in syndrome. For a person, there's a situation where a person can look brain dead from the outside, but actually be conscious. And it's a horrific state. It's like being buried alive. There's a famous book called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly that was written by a Frenchman who had locked-in syndrome. And after a very long period of time, managed to convince his aide that he was actually still in there. He could blink his eyes. And so she set up a system where he could indicate letters by blinking his eyes at the right time.
Mhm.
And he wrote an entire book, one letter at a time.
I remember that. I
So
remember that story.
what happens with the non-material is the non-material realizes that at the end of a half cycle, it's going to be in a state that's the equivalent of locked-in syndrome for a period of about 9,000 years. Now, as I said, that's the equivalent of being buried alive unless you have someone who knows you're there. And unfortunately, at the same stage in the cycle, when the non-material is at its least material, the material side is at its most material, which is furthest distance from any perception of non-materiality at all. That's where we're at right now. So non-materiality during the middle of the cycle steps through and tries to set up a structure for society, for humanity, that has the hope of retaining knowledge of the fact that the non-material consciousness is there, so that when it's locked in, it'll have compatriots to take action and to respond to it, like the aid would for the guy in France.
So is this for them specifically, or does
I
this
can't
happen
hear
on our? Can
Yeah, I can hear you.
now is this from our side as well, or is it just their side? Can you hear me, Laird?
We have a delay.
Ah. If now is this from their side specifically and only their side, or do we have this this side as well? Like, are we going to be locked in? So I think
It's a cycle. So we're in alternating roles over a period of 25,000 years. We play alternating roles. So we're at our most material right now. 12,000 years from now, we'll be the non-material.
well, how will we know that we're going to be the non-material? Like, do we have? I'm going to say we don't have history that goes back that far necessarily, although we do have extensive records of anything from fossils to tools to cave paintings. Like there is human history that's gone back that far. How do we like? Are we looking at non-material compared to them, but we're still kind of existing? Like, how does that work if we have continuous continuous existence or records of continuous existence going back millions of years?
This delay makes it hard.
Okay. Now, Laird, are you listening on the delay for the stream, or are you listening in through Skype? Let's see. Background, video. Okay. I think Laird may have been listening in through the YouTube stream, which I know is going to be delayed by about 30 seconds to a minute. So I know that can be quite difficult if that's the case. Although I have to say is I'm pretty interested to see exactly what that position is, because I know from, if there's the 25,000 year cycle, if we're immaterial versus they're immaterial, is it, kind of like like how is that determined? Are we immaterial but still actually within our own realm or not? Those kinds of things are fairly interesting from even from a philosophical standpoint. Let me see here. Ooh. Oh, okay. All right, so we'll bring Laird back on in about 30 seconds. I think my camera's still... Yeah, my camera's frozen on that one. Properties. Save. Activate. Activate. Is that working? There we go. Configure video. So this is kind of the thing. I was like, with this camera, if every single time I switch between OBS and the camera, I basically have to unplug the camera, plug it back in. These are the things that at least a good shakedown of the new studio is a good idea to check out, because I have it attached to the front of my workstation down here, but if we're in the back of the computer, every single time I did this, I'd have to literally crawl under the desk, disconnect it, and reconnect it. I'm definitely going to bring this one to the office and bring my other one back. That one was a little more reliable. This one's just too finicky. Let's see if I can bring Laird back in.
One more try.
There we go, Laird. So I'm going to bring you back in, although I'm going to let's see. We're going to have you full screen, and you won't be able to see me necessarily.
Okay.
Like we'll do this old school where I have like my video, like my camera on.
No, the problem was on our end. For some reason, my Chromebook lost Wi-Fi when our PC didn't.
Oh, that's annoying.
Weird.
Technology. What are you going to do? So
Yeah.
we're going to do this old school where I'm going to have you on the big screen, and I'm just going to be kind of floating here, so you'll be able to see me on the stream.
Okay.
But on Skype, I can't. Apparently, with this camera, I can't have both OBS and Skype going at the same time.
Right.
So blame Logitech for that one. So where were we? Yes.
Okay, we were talking about the motivation for non-materiality to teach us, and so what we get is a very structured society at about 9,000 BC, and we have an esoteric tradition that is essentially it's an interview process. It's selecting people who are able to learn the mode of communication between the symbolic mode of communication between the non-material consciousness and us. That the whole relationship between the initiate and the informant in the esoteric tradition is repeated practice in that mode of communication. That the informant is not allowed to initiate anything. The initiate is responsible for asking the next question, and if it's an appropriate question, the informant is required to give the initiate a truthful answer. If it's not an appropriate question, the informant is required to remain silent. And so the hope is that by the end of the cycle down through the generations, that the structure will be coherent enough to retain a group of people in the world who in all sorts of different ways are still able to connect to the non-material consciousness.
Okay. And if, this, at least for them, Like, how many times has this happened according to the Dogon?
Endlessly. It's a recurring cycle. It's the metaphor is to the natural water cycle, but as you get to the bottom of how the energetics work, you realize that it's not a metaphor, that the energy works according to the same pattern as the natural water cycle.
Now, if our universe is supposed to last for, trillions of years, if we're talking heat death of the universe, or a big crunch, or if there's heat death and then something happens and we go back into a Big Bang type of scenario, um, is this looked at as more of our time is going much faster than theirs? Is it kind of like ours is going faster than theirs, but theirs is going faster than ours, but somehow it's kind of filtering through to where there's just this one meeting point where time is synced up? Like how is this
Okay,
looked
it's
at?
it's a, it's a progression. Okay, imagine videotape of traffic on a highway at night. You can see all the headlights of the individual cars moving along the highway. Now, if I turn the pace of the video playback up, if I quicken it fast enough, you reach a point where you no longer see the individual cars, you see streaks of light. You see what looks like energy. It's because precisely because of the difference in the pace of time that it looks like energy to us. That along this continuum of energy, if you look back, okay, the domains of energy are differentiated by factors of 10. If you look back 4 domains, you have the equivalent of quantum entanglement for us. There have actually been scientific studies. A group conducted a bunch of experiments on electrons, first not entangled with each other and then entangled with each other, and discovered that the interactions happen 10,000 times more quickly for the entangled ones than the ones that aren't. And entanglement is really a factor of time. It's exactly the same thing we're doing right here. That because our connection is so ultra quick, it's as if we're in the same room with each other. Space no longer matters. And that's what entanglement is. It's not that the space isn't there. The distance between us is still real, but the connection is so quick that it doesn't factor in anymore.
And how is this concept tying into your newer work? I know that you have a new book that you're currently in the final stages of. Like, how are you tying this concept into some of the newer concepts that you're bringing forward?
Well, to get at that, we really have to talk about the previous book, which was called Amma and the Spark of the Universe. Here's what's going on. Okay, you have energy, as I said, you have a perpetual cycle of energy where the stages of the cycle, I got to back this up. This is hard to explain. What we have just been talking about is the materializing half of the cycle. It's moving from a state of superconductivity to material forms and then eventually on to a state of superinsulation. That's half the cycle. The other half of the cycle brings it back from superinsulation back to superconductivity again. But in the overall cycle, you've got exact parallels to the natural water cycle that Hinduism describes as a state, a pre-manifested state of energy called Omkara, where energy exists as potentials. Scientifically, that compares to structures called instanton knots. Instanton knots are little tangles that develop in waves, and they can create them in bodies of water and they can create them in energy. They naturally occur. They happen all by themselves. And those instanton knots, theory says that at the center of those knots is the potential for 3 monopoles of energy. Now, that produces what we know as a superconductive state. And in a superconductive state, you have this instantaneous perpetual flow of electricity that's not being resisted by anything. But any disruption to that flow of energy creates a spark, and the spark causes those three potential monopoles to condense.
Mhm.
That's the term science uses. The instanton knots condense into monopoles of energy. And at that stage of the cycle, what's condensing are the spark, which is a monopole of electricity. It's an electron or potential electron, and two monopoles that become a magnet. That's the root unit of energy. It's the equivalent of a proton-electron pair. The instanton knots themselves are associated with Hawking radiation, which the scientists say evaporates from black holes.
Hmm.
So you have an evaporation process, you have a condensation process, you have an accumulating process, and you have a sort of a redistributing process that are exactly parallel to the natural water cycle. So all of the metaphors, the symbolic metaphors about things being connected to the natural water cycle aren't metaphors, they're objectively true.
Now, have you heard of the Diehold Foundation?
I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. Now, what have you heard? I know McAllis had asked if you'd heard about it and what your opinion would be on it, as far as their like how they're looking at uh, at least very very similar things to a certain extent, where they're talking about, let's say, like waveform superimposed on a toroid like toroidal um, um, energy, or how, let's say, like a carbon atom comes into this dimension, and how that's being connected to, like, let's say, the Hebrew alphabet. It seems like there's like at least some overlap with some of the terminology, and I've never heard of it myself. So this is somewhat.
This is a simpler perspective than that. When those monopoles emerge,
Mhm.
you can think of it as, even though there's a dimensional separation between the electrical side of it and the magnetic side of it, you can think of the 3 points as being the two magnetic monopoles as being on either side of the electrical one, in what's the equivalent of a one-dimensional setting. Um, that magnetism can only sit in two postures, with the North Pole up or the North Pole down. We can think of it that way. And so as these monopoles emerge, the same spark that caused them to condense also causes them to rotate, because that's what magnetism does. And when it rotates, the electron, which is between the two poles of the magnet, rotates with it. The magnetism evokes a space that allows the electron to extend a little bit.
Okay.
And that sets off a chain reaction that is in miniature scale all the way up the scale, sort of compares to what happens with the formation of a hydrogen atom. There's a perspective from which the extension of space is also sort of illusional. I'll try to explain how that works and why it works. Imagine that we were an objective observer. We were standing outside the system with time running at its fastest pace, and we could objectively measure what the duration of a moment was. And in that moment, because light moves at a constant speed, we would know how far light extended in the course of a moment. We could calculate it. Now, with the rotation of these monopoles, you're increasing mass and you're slowing time frame a little bit. Imagine that someone came along and doubled the objective duration of that moment, that a moment as suddenly took twice as long as it had yesterday. In that doubled moment, because light moves at a constant speed, it would be able to extend twice as far as it had in the previous moment. And so by every measure that we have to judge by, space would be expanding. It would be extending, even though, in fact, all that had changed was the pace of time had slowed. That under the covers, so to speak, space might not actually be expanding at all. As a matter of fact, there are Egyptian references that make it look as if it's not really expanding.
We run into these types of concepts fairly regularly. I know, like losing track of time is an expression that's as old as time, and you never a watch pot never boils. The concept that time is, even though we do have measurements for it, it's something that can still be lost either cognitively or through our own attention, loss of attention, time blindness with individuals who are ADHD or who may be on the spectrum. They don't necessarily perceive time as somebody whom it may not be. So like these types of perceptions of concept really bring to mind how even our own consciousness interacts with reality and what is reality to a certain extent, and whether it's subjective or if there's something that is subjective to that reality. And that brings in a whole host of super deep philosophical questions that probably go way deeper than a lot of time we have for tonight.
But some of those are answered by the tradition. For example, consciousness and time are both treated as, or consciousness is treated as a manifested state.
Okay.
Actually, magnetism and electricity are treated as manifested forms. The instant-on knots are treated as potential forms. They're not manifested yet. So the perspective that consciousness is everything, that everything derives from consciousness, makes no sense in this system, because you have to have, for an event to take place, you already have to have an oscillation of time.
Mm-hmm.
For any event to happen. For a conscious thought to happen, you have to have an oscillation of time, which means time has got to precede consciousness. And if consciousness is a factor of the two energies, and the energies are manifested forms, then consciousness doesn't exist at the level of the primordial knot.
Oh, my brain is starting to hurt with this. These are concepts most of us don't even think about on a daily basis. We're like we go through the day going, okay, I'm going to get some coffee. I got to go through traffic, get to work,
Yeah.
start up my computer, go through all these things. We don't necessarily, a lot. I'm not going to say we. A lot of people don't necessarily consider the nature of consciousness and how. How that's manifested or how that connects to, let's say, the fundamental forces within the universe, or even if it does. And it's like trying to be able to consider a tesseract. We can look at a tesseract on a computer, or at least a 2D rendering of a 3D shape that's doing something in 4D, but we don't necessarily understand the concept of how that would work within the real world, within our own perception.
Right, but from my perspective, that's entirely overcomplicating the situation. That the dynamics, the underlying dynamics we're working with are far, far, far simpler than that. And if you examine things at the level of the root dynamics, you get a really good explanation for how it all comes together without having to resort to those higher forms that get created. The root of sacred geometry is simply a set of circles of vectors that are used to align a Buddhist stupa. They represent the fundamental process of how space, what do they say? The geometry recapitulates how space emerges. But as you become familiar with it, you also see that it recapitulates how time works.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the reason I like the Dogon system here is because it keeps things on a very fundamental level to be able to explain other very complicated things, but without having to wrap your brain around a tesseract.
How is it we can explain this with, like, let's say, an everyday object? I know if we're looking at how energy transitions to its biological cell. Can we use the example of a seed, for instance?
Well, I can give you some example of some of the symbolic representations, and
Okay.
that might illustrate some of it for you. The Dogon agriculture is based on an arrangement of plots of land. What they do is they measure out 9 squares of land as its own square. So you have 8 squares around the outside and then 1 square in the middle. And each of the outer squares is assigned to a family to farm, and the center plot becomes a common well that all the other plots share.
Okay.
That arrangement is what biologists I read describe as the most efficient way of distributing energy in a biological cell. Now, the same system, it's called the Wellfield Plan, existed in ancient China in ancient times. There, you have some complications because what happened at 3000 BC didn't get written down until around 300 BC. And so they're in endless fights with each other about what's true and what's not. But there was a Wellfield Plan that was an exact match for the Dogon Plan that some scholars feel was only theoretical and other scholars say was implemented. But it's a root concept of the cosmology. It's a signature of the cosmology. Any culture that was instructed in this cosmology would have known about it. And the reason they know about it is because it recreates this method of distribution of energy in a cell. It's fundamental.
I'm trying to be able to recall back grade 10 biology, and unfortunately, I don't really remember much from that year, unfortunately. But I do remember, at least like I have the diagram of the cell that they made us draw, to at least, and then to memorize the parts, and at least I couldn't label it to be able to save my life at this point, but the concept is at least. It's interesting to be able to say, okay, well, this concept of how energy is being able to distribute it within the cell is then propagated throughout, throughout even just base processes of community setup. So it's kind of like saying, okay, well, the principles that work on the small scale work on the large scale as well.
Right. Well, Dogon society, you come to realize that all the structures of Dogon daily life center on these energetic principles of biology, down to the layout of the Dogon village and what building they build first and all sorts of things like that. But if we can go back for a moment to the 3 monopoles that condense in the superconductive state, they condense and then they rotate. There's a critical thing going on there that the biologists and the astrophysicists all ignore. It's a critical factor that none of them look at or even consider. In a superconductive domain, according to the Dogon, you automatically arrive at a superconductive condition in any circumstance where all the magnetism, all the little tiny magnets line up the same way. If you line them up one way, you get superconductivity. If you line them up the other way, you get superinsulation. So when the 3 monopoles are condensed and they rotate, suddenly as a unit, they're sitting anti-parallel to the rest of the superconductive domain. And we know that parallel magnetism pulls together and anti-parallel magnetism pushes apart. So as soon as those monopoles rotate, they get pushed out of the domain and self-define a second domain that becomes the material domain.
So what you're saying is that in the way is that this transition is also somewhat of a real world, very microscopic, very small microcosm to this transition that the Dogon are saying that they've been taught happens between the material and immaterial every 25,000 years. So it's kind of the same principle, but on a much.
Yes, it's based on that. The cycle is based on the same principles.
Okay.
But that's the same set of principles that govern a dipole, the in-out action of a dipole. It's the same principles that govern our sun's relationship to the Sirius stars. Now, in a biological organism, there's a thing that happens that the biologists don't understand. Inside every aqueous membrane in a living creature, what naturally develops, what naturally differentiates is what's called a zone of coherent water, where it's called an exclusion zone. It's where most of the components of a cell are pushed out of this zone, little zone that's several microns thick, right up next to every aqueous membrane. And there's hardly 70% of an organism is within microns of an aqueous membrane. That exclusion zone consists of deconstructed water molecules that, because as they're deconstructed, line up like little magnets to create a superconductive zone. And it's through that zone becomes a global reservoir for energy for the entire organism, from which these monopoles, which are effectively protons and electrons, can be evoked at any time by a spark. And every organic reaction, every root reaction in a biological entity begins with a spark.
And I have a feeling this is why your next work is going to be called
The Waters of Life.
Well, there you go. It makes perfect sense now about how that ties together. Now I know this book is in, and we're getting close to the midnight hour here on the East Coast, to 10 p.m. for 9 p.m. for all of you West Coast folk, where it's probably still nice and warm and we're still dealing with snow and ice, but you're in the final editing stages of this book, correct?
Right. Hopefully within a month, the book will be available for publication.
No, are you? I know that you had several books that you self-published. Is this going to be going through your publishing house?
Well, the majority of my books have been published through Simon & Schuster, through a subsidiary, an imprint called Inner Traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, what was happening was that the lead time from submission of a manuscript to the time when the book actually was published became about 18 months. And I was researching and writing things much quicker than that. And I discovered after a while that I could self-publish a second book 6 months in, and ended up publishing 2 books a year, one self-published, one traditionally published. So I did that for 4 years. For the last 2 books, I've opted to self-publish them instead because I have so much better control over the timetable and the details of what goes into the book, and control over how I want to name the book. And I have enough of a following that I don't necessarily need the publisher as a conduit to get the book sold.
You just come on a podcast like this and say, it's like, hey, I'm putting out a new book, and here's a teaser for like the main concepts and how it ties into everything else I've done before. In all honesty, it's one of the best things you could possibly do, because at least at this point you get to talk to people who at minimum are aware of what you actually do, and if you're like myself, where it's like we've talked about all of these concepts before, I just need to be able to brush myself up on some of them, but still it's like you look at it and it's a cohesive story with each one being its own small part,
Right.
and it's kind of like Pokemon. You got to catch them all.
One other point I wanted to make was what happens with those monopoles when they rotate and the electron effectively moves out and eventually becomes an electron around a proton in a hydrogen atom. Those are entangled particles in a hydrogen atom that when you flip the spin attribute of the electron, you automatically flip the spin attribute of the proton. They're entangled. Well, the Dogon are saying that's exactly what happened when our sun emerged in the company of the two Sirius stars from a spiral of the Orion Nebula. That we were originally in a triplet with them, the same way that I was talking about those monopoles, and that our sun was ejected by exactly the same dynamic. The Dogon even draw the dynamic, moving ever more further outward away from the Sirius stars, which act like the proton,
Mm-hmm.
and our solar system is orbiting the Sirius stars, or orbiting with the Sirius stars.
Now, I'll ask, is this meant to be like an allegory just for our sun, or is this something that has happened like with other stars?
We can expect it to happen with every binary pair, every binary star system.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty wild. And this is like with every single conversation we have, I always like walk away and I think about it for 3 or 4 days. So I know it.
Now the implication is,
Mhm.
because the energetics are parallel, that our sun is entangled with the Sirius stars.
Well, how far away are we from them?
About 8 light years.
So, let's see. Like, is that far enough to be like obviously, like, gravitational interaction happens, like, this pen will gravitationally act with the moon, even though it's on such a minute scale, it's not necessarily measurable.
Right.
But if
it's not the gravity of the stars that's causing the rotation to happen. They came out of a spiraling birthplace of stars called Barnard's Loop, which is huge. As a matter of fact, the measure of Barnard's Loop in light years is a match for the measure of the Great Pyramid in cubits.
Okay, that's
So it's the rotation of that gigantic spiral,
yes.
that birthplace of stars, that's pulling our sun around in a circle and causing precession. And because the dynamic of our sun is like the dynamic of electron, the continuum of energy that we experience is a match for what an electron experiences in a hydrogen atom. Same dynamic.
Wow. Okay. I'm wow. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
enough to bite off in one.
pretty much. As I recall, like our first episode, like the first episode we did way back when, and like I didn't really talk for like 2 days after our show, just because of everything that we talked about. I'm like, okay, well, how did that work? Then how did this work? And it just took me a while to be able to chew through it. I remember the time that we came on afterwards, I was just peppering off questions to you left, right, and center. So I know we had said, okay, well, we're probably going to talk about a lot tonight. And there's always a chance for part 2 at some point in the future. Once I can go through the transcript, once I can pinpoint all the questions and all the the topics that I'm missing here. And by that point, the book will probably be very close to publication. So it'll be good for a good follow-up on the Waters of Life.
Yeah, that'd be fun. That'd be great. I'd be happy to do that.
All right, that would be amazing. Wow, we did the full 2 hours, ladies and gents. And it's different now, and instead of like before, where it's like we would just go for like 4 or 5 hours nonstop. And I see some of these other podcasters like, we went for 6 hours. I'm like, amateurs. We've done 12. It's like been there, done that. I'm too old now. I can't go that long.
Heck, we went for an hour and a half just trying to get my computer to connect.
Well, hey, everything happens for a reason, and it's like the technology says if it's that important and you're going to get the words out, it's going to happen. We're just going to throw a wrench in just to see your perseverance on the matter. So I got to say, everyone, I've had a blast tonight. Laird, thank you so much for your time and for your energy. It's always an absolute pleasure, and I'm blessed, and I'm fortunate to know individuals such as yourself, and to all the listeners out there. Thank you for joining me tonight, for the 100 or so people that watched in, and we're gonna do this again next week at the same time. Next week, though, we have another guest, a good friend of the show, and I do believe I'm going to double check my calendar just so if I announce his name and I'm wrong, he's just going to be like, Chris, what'd you do? Like, next week, what week? Yes, going forward, Thursday. That is, Thursday's the 23rd. A dentist appointment that day. Where's my stuff? Oh my goodness, it's not even on here. I'm kidding. I'm just gonna, gun it and hopefully I'm right. Denver Michaels is coming on the show. We'll be talking cryptozoology and all of his latest books. I know he had Men of Renown come out, the massive 700-page tome on giant myth. It's pretty much like my thing, or at least everything's my thing when it comes to this stuff. So tune in, ladies and gents and pineapples. If you're not here, it's be here or be trapezoid, as I say. So, Laird, thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful evening. We'll talk again soon. And again, I'll hit you up on Facebook in a couple of days once this gets edited and is ready for full-time distribution to a new process.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
It's my pleasure. Have a good night. Have a good night, everybody.